Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. Tamzyn Murphy is a registered dietitian with special interest and expertise in therapeutic carbohydrate restriction, or TCR. She holds a master's degree in physiology, in which she investigated and published on the topic of low carbohydrate, healthy fat diets and type 2 diabetes. She is currently a content editor and creator, as well as a contributing lecturer at the online professional training platform Nutrition Network. Tamzyn also serves on the board of directors of Eat Better South Africa, a community based outreach program that implements nutritional education in lower socioeconomic status communities. Tamzyn is a leading editor and contributing author, for the textbook Ketogenic, The Science of Therapeutic Carbohydrate Restriction in Human Health. She has also co authored, contributed to, and edited other books, including Sugar Free and Eat Right Revolution, articles, and peer reviewed publications on the topic of TCR. Tamzyn also has experience in training, research, and development of nutritional supplements, as well as clinical experience in private dietetics practice and community interventions focusing on TCR, or again, therapeutic carbohydrate restriction. Tamzyn Murphy, what an absolute honor it is to welcome you to Boundless Body Radio.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Casey. It's really great to be here.
It is an honor to host you. I got to see you in person in San Diego. Unfortunately, our paths didn't cross. I lamented the fact that I wasn't able to meet you in person. But your presentation on Friday morning was absolutely wonderful. I was so
Thank
anxious to get you on the show to discuss some of the things that you've learned along the way. As we mentioned, South Africa in the introduction, you don't live in the States. It's quite far for you to journey to San
you.
Diego. I hope it was worth it for you. Do you have any highlights of the conference that really stood out besides your presentation?
Oh, it was absolutely worth it for me. Um, yeah, I think I loved the metabolic psychiatry day. I think that was just so exciting because it's such a burgeoning field and it's in its infancy, but there is mounting evidence. I mean, it's mounting at the rate of knots, right? And then if you also look back at the early evidence for things like ketogenic diet and epilepsy and all the stuff that was mounting with regards to neurology, like let's say Alzheimer's disease, then you start to get an idea that actually there's a lot of this has been around much longer than we thought, and we're just starting to connect the dots now. So that was super exciting. Meeting all the big names was super exciting. But also, starting to get an idea of the smaller names of the people that I hadn't experienced before and how much this has changed their lives, how much changing the way that they eat and the way that they live and moving towards more of an ancestral way of eating and way of living has changed people's lives to the point that they want to make a difference in other people's lives. People like you. I've met someone called he calls himself the Fat Ginger Nerd who had written a book about his weight loss journey. Everyone there was there because this has made such a big difference in their lives or the lives of the people that they love, and they want to pass that forward. So I think it's a wonderful space to be in, and we really can change people's lives.
Yeah, I love that point. It was interesting to sit in the crowd and like just kind of scan the crowd and see all of my friends, people I've gotten to interview and meet, and you're looking and like, oh, he survived cancer and she got over bipolar
Mm.
and she also survived cancer and got through chemo really easy and he lost 150 pounds and like there's so many stories out there. Like you said, it's
So many.
absolutely crazy. And then you're right, that Thursday at the conference that was all about mental health was absolutely mega. That was so good and it didn't stop on that Thursday, right? Like your
No.
presentation on Friday was all about mental health, and there were many other
Yeah.
presentations where that was brought up. I've kind of like been talking to people about the conference, and it's like you go to this conference about a certain diet, and you expect that the whole thing is going to be about weight loss and obesity, and it's so crazy how little those
Mm.
things were actually even mentioned. Like that's like a given
Mm.
at this point. It's so much more
Exactly.
um, expansive. The things that we get to
Mm.
talk about in this space is incredible.
Exactly. I've had kind of probably the worst thing that's been leveled at me is, and me in this whole space that I work in, right, that we work in, is, oh, you think that keto is a magic bullet that's just going to fix everything. Well, how can we believe that? And the thing is, in a way, it kind of is because all of the diseases of modern lifestyle have have a commonality at their root cause. And that's why it's not so much as, it's one bullet that is hitting a whole lot of things separately. It's one bullet that's hitting the root that all of these things are branches of, whether it is mental health, whether it is weight, whether it is diabetes, whether it is cancer, as you said. There's so many things, all of the diseases of modern lifestyle that weren't here before. They come from the same root, and that is metabolic dysfunction. And that's
Yeah.
what we're addressing.
It's so amazing. Well, I'm really curious to hear your story. I know you have quite the history of what brought you into here. I hope a lot of our listeners would be listening to the introduction, hear your name, hear where you're from, hear that you're a registered dietitian, and maybe make some connections to somebody who's very special in this space, a certain Timothy Noakes. Can you tell us about your own history of training as a dietitian and some of the health issues that you were dealing with at the time as well?
Absolutely. So I trained very traditionally as a very traditional dietitian, um, food pyramid, my plate kind of stuff, with grains being the basis of every meal. You want plenty of legumes, plenty of fruit, plenty of vegetables, and you really want to keep fat to a minimum, all that kind of thing. Red meat must be to a minimum. So I learned that and I bought into that because that's what I was taught during my studies, during my tertiary education. And I left and I went to work in the government sector during my community service year, which all healthcare professionals in South Africa have to do. We have to do a year of community service in the lower socioeconomic status areas because there's just not enough service provision. So it's a way to make sure that we change people's lives, give them healthcare when they can't access it enough. So it's a really awesome initiative. The problem is that people like me were giving the wrong dietary advice. And unsurprisingly, I mean, 70% of South African women are overweight or obese. We have got just, even though we are a third world country or a lower socioeconomic status country, we have got just as bad obesity and chronic associated diseases of lifestyle as the United States has. You know, even though we're eating potentially differently, we have very different level of income, but people are fat and people are sick. And yes, I sometimes help people lose weight by telling them to cut a whole lot of their, sugar-laden fizzy drinks. And if they were doing a lot of that, you just cut those things and suddenly they will lose a bit of weight. But it doesn't get them completely healthy. And after that, I went into the supplement industry and I also started I became an editor for a health magazine, which I was very into. I really enjoyed that. I got to research a whole lot of things as they came out and keep abreast of the research and the literature that was coming out in the scientific world as well for this magazine. And during that work, I came across Banting, as we called it in South Africa back then, Prof. Noakes. It was, I think, 2012. He started talking big and loud to everyone who would listen across the globe, but especially in South Africa, saying he'd got it wrong. You mustn't make carbs the basis of your diet. You don't need carbs to run a good race. You need to actually eat low carb because his father died of diabetes. He's got diabetes now, and this has reversed his diabetes. He read the new Atkins for New You. Um, by Westman and Volek and Finney, I think. And this has turned his health around, and he wanted to turn the health around of the entire of South Africa. And all of us dietitians and everyone else who'd been trained traditionally thought, wow, he's finally lost it. This is insane, right? Like he's promoting a fad diet. And this is an A1 rated scientist who's been given all sorts of prizes for his scientific work. He's opened up our Sports Science Institute. He's recognized globally. He's got, I can't even tell you how many citations, how many peer-reviewed publications he has. So I was like, okay, maybe, he's just gone a bit crazy at last, but he was a good scientist in his day. And then I start researching it because now I need to write articles on it. And I also need to edit or fact check the other journalists' articles on the topic. And paleo also started coming in around then. So I'm researching it. And the more I look into the scientific literature, because as a healthcare professional, you're trained to go where the science, to go to actual source, not to go to other, second sources like other media. You actually go to PubMed, you go to Google Scholar, you go to the journals, the peer-reviewed journals, and you read. And so I did that and I started reading and realizing that actually what he was saying was true. I started reading Gary Taubes, I started reading Robert Lustig, and I realized that actually sugar wasn't as innocuous as we thought. It wasn't just it wasn't bad just because it's giving you empty calories, as I was taught. It's bad for far worse reasons than that. And carbs, which I thought were very innocuous, being like white bread, pasta. I told the people, I remember the nurses at the facilities I used to work at, they were like, well, I've got to lose weight. I need to stop eating bread. And I was like, that's rubbish. Like, carry on eating bread, just make sure your calories are controlled and you'll lose weight. And I told them this, right? So as I was researching, I realized that Noakes was right. There was research to back this up, and I started writing articles on it. And then he came to Cape Town for a talk at one of the universities, and I got time off work to go to that talk because my boss said, well, I was still working for the supplement company. She said, well, if you go and find out if Noakes can be an expert witness against the Sugar Association, because we had had the Sugar Association had lodged a complaint against an advert that we had for stevia. And in this advert, the stevia advert, the company I worked for had said things like, eating too much sugar makes you fat. Eating too much sugar causes diabetes. Eating too much sugar can contribute to cancer. So the Sugar Association was angry about these statements, and they took the company I worked for to the Advertising Standards Authority, and we needed expert witnesses against the Sugar Association. So they said, well, if you're going to Noakes's talk, find out if he'll be an expert witness. So I did, and he said yes, because it was against the Sugar Association, but he wanted me to work with him because he didn't have much time to write it up. So I worked with him, and eventually I did my master's with him, and I started working in the space. So that's how I got into the space. And now I work for Nutrition Network, which is an amazing online training platform, also started by Prof. Noakes, amongst others, um, so that we can train other dietitians, doctors, nurses, psychologists, allied healthcare professionals, coaches, and even lay people now on what this dietary intervention or lifestyle choice can do for one's health and for patients, so that when you end up like me, leaving university with the wrong information, you can continue to learn, update your information, and also earn CEUs while you do it, which is amazing because all healthcare professionals have to have a certain number of points every year to remain registered. So that's what we do. And we've run courses on obesity or on cancer, treating cancer this way, or on treating mental health this way. So it's really an exciting space to work in. And yeah, so how did I kind of get into it? I got into it through this magazine, but I also tried it myself. And I had gut problems, which were, well, at the time I'd been diagnosed with inflammatory bowel disease, ulcerative colitis. You may have, if you follow the space, you know that Nick Norwitz also has that. Um, and that now there's been a recent trial that's come out showing that it's that a keto or a carnivore animal-based keto diet um, significantly positively impacts on the symptoms of ulcerative colitis. There's also a really great study by Scholl, Mailing, and Wood, who do a great review of all the mechanisms behind how a ketogenic diet can actually benefit the gut rather than even if it's high in red meat, which everyone for a while thought would cause colon cancer and make your gut really unhealthy. Um, but yeah, so they explain why it really doesn't, and they list the mechanistic, rodent, and other studies about that. So basically, that's what I found in practice was that going on keto helped reduce my gastrointestinal symptoms, and then eventually going on carnivore with fermented dairy basically helped resolve my symptoms most of the time. And I say most of the time because I want to add the caveat that I thought for a while that I was cured, if you will, or in full remission. But the truth is that I go through flare-up phases. Well, let's first say that I was re-diagnosed actually with just IBS. And the fact that I had had ulcerative colitis symptoms apparently were due to an infection or taking non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, namely ibuprofen, which can cause ulcers in the gut and bleeding. So the doctors now think that actually I don't have ulcerative colitis. that I just have IBS and I happen to have bad luck. So I don't know, but either way, I have really bad symptoms, and the symptoms do come back when I am highly stressed, when I cheat on my diet, do things such as drink wine. You would think on keto, and by wine, I mean like 2 centimeters of wine. You would think that that's fine, right? On keto, it's fine. You can have 2 centimeters of red wine. But when you are broken in your gut and that happens to be a trigger for you, you can't. So, as soon as I step over this line because I'm thinking, oh, I'm feeling pretty good, then I get a relapse, if you will. And actually, funnily enough, I'm very anti-medication, as many people in our space are. But I have started taking a tricyclic antidepressant, a very old one called amitriptyline, at a very low dose, the dose that they give to little boys who wet their beds,
Mm.
because of it's not because of its effect on the brain, but because of its effect on the muscles. Like in the case of bedwetters, it would be the bladder muscle, so it actually helps to prevent that. But in the case, it turns out that it also affects the muscles in the gut and the hypersensitivity within the gut. And there's been a randomized control trial with a few hundred people this year that showed that very low dose amitriptyline helps with IBS in the majority of cases, and I have found that to be the case for me. Um, However, I still carnivore, and I still and with a bit of dairy, and I'll say carnivore-ish because I cheat on that. But for me, that was my I suppose path or my road with this was that during all of this academic and career in the space, I too was following it, and I still do. It's very much a lifestyle for me, and if I don't eat this way, I end up with major flare-ups that make my life really unpleasant. So yes, I've added a medication, a very low dose medication, and funnily enough, it's helping from someone who really doesn't like medication. So that also goes to show that in some cases, medication can help, um, even for chronic diseases, whereas I would normally say, or chronic conditions, whereas I'd normally say, yes, obviously, if you've got a terrible, terrible infection or you starting to prevent gangrene in your leg, you might want to take, antibiotics if you've had a terrible wound. So there's surgery, obviously, there's place for that. There's place for medications. Um, but funnily enough, sometimes even with conditions like this, there might be place for medications, like maybe metformin in diabetes. Yes, you might go into remission, but still a lot of people just stay on metformin because there are still some benefits there. So I just wanted to kind of play devil's advocate there. But that's my story. That's my story in a nutshell.
That's beautiful. I love that. That's amazing. I want to take you back to the time that you were first learning about Professor Noakes. I believe you said it was 2012. When you heard the term type 2 diabetes reversal or remission, was that new to you? Had you been trained on any of that? Like, did you know that concept at all?
Oh no, it was completely new. Diabetes, type 2 diabetes is known as a chronic progressive disease, a chronic progressive condition. So chronic means long term, progressive means it gets worse, and that's it. It's long term and it gets worse. There's no cure, there's no, turning it backwards. But that's actually the topic I did my master's on, was we did a pilot study on 30 people who had turned their own diabetes around. And we found that 75% of our sample truly were in remission as defined by normal HbA1c levels, and withdrawal of all medication apart from metformin, which we left. Many of them just stayed on metformin. So no more insulin, no more sulfonylureas, no more other diabetes medication, and normal blood glucose levels. So that was defined as remission, and that's 75% we found in our study, which is very much the same as has been found in other studies, whether that's the Verta studies, whether that's Unwin from the UK. They find about a similar, you could call it reversal rate or remission rate. I think remission is probably more accurate because if they go back onto carbs, which get broken down to sugar, their body still can't handle it, and they're still going to have high blood sugar levels, which is defined as diabetes. So they haven't reversed their disease in a similar way to, like, let's say, a child who's perfectly healthy who can eat like a sandwich and not get very high blood sugar or pathological blood sugar spike. So they're not going to respond in the way a diabetic does. So these people still respond as diabetics if they're fed diabetic food, but they're
Mm.
certainly put into remission. In other words, they have no sign of disease so long as they avoid food that's broken down into sugars.
Yeah, wow. It's so interesting. I obviously being a trainer and a nutrition coach, I was never working with type 2 diabetes that much. I
Mm.
couldn't have described what the disease was or anything about it. So when I heard that it was reversible, like it wasn't that big of a deal to me. But for
Mm.
somebody who was trained in that, like it
Oh,
would be
it's
so
huge.
interesting to, yeah, to go back to that moment of like, what do you, what are you talking about remission? What are you talking
Yeah.
about reversal? Like you don't reverse this. What is this? That would just must have been just such an interesting kind of a moment to be in.
Yeah,
Wow.
absolutely, absolutely, totally amazing. Which is why I studied it, because that's the start of everything. The start of everything, I think, for people who go, well, maybe not for you, but for most healthcare professionals, I find that we start with the insulin resistance. Kind of, we don't necessarily see the weight loss first, or we don't see the energy levels first, like a personal trainer might, but we see, okay, these people are having the insulin resistance, whether that is in the form of diabetes, prediabetes, metabolic syndrome, polycystic ovarian syndrome, we're seeing that reverse. Um, and that's huge. And then as soon as you realize, oh, this way of eating reverses insulin resistance, then you start extrapolating from there because so many conditions have insulin resistance at their root. And that's kind of once you go from there, it's just like this whole world, this whole complicated or exciting world opens up to you. And then you realize that this what is at the root cause of so many things and why eating this way can help.
Yeah,
And it's
that's
beyond it,
so
it goes beyond insulin as well, Casey. You
so
think, oh, okay, eating low carb or restricting sugar is going to restrict your insulin and lower your insulin, but it's beyond that. The more you kind of start opening different cans of worms.
yeah. Well, that's such a great point. And you might think that, you're talking about 30 people in your study. So that's not
Mm,
very big numbers, but we
mm,
we often forget 30, those are 30 lives, right? Like there's a story behind that. And in your
mm,
presentation, you did such a great job of highlighting that as well. It was a case study that you were presenting, but you did such a great job of describing a little girl in a study and describing her life. And again, you look at these case studies, these N of one studies, and a lot of us are now in this habit of like, oh, well, it's just one person, it's
mm,
just a case study. We often forget like this is the most important study for that little girl, and this is how her life has changed. And so I
mm.
love how you did that. Can you tell us a little bit about that research and how that came about for you?
Absolutely. So I think being in the space that I'm in and working with Nutrition Network, we were developing a course called Metabolism and the Mind. And so during the development of this course, I'm privileged enough to be able to develop a lot of the course material and the curriculum that goes into these courses, which means that I'm exposed to, again, a lot of the research. And so I decided, well, I've got this little girl who's been put onto um, SSRIs, which are the typical antidepressants. In fact, one of the first medications she was put onto was Prozac, which we all know that that name brand of that one. But then also another one was Serdep, and she was put onto these medications. She had side effects. She didn't get any benefit from it, but she did get side effects from it, and her problems continued and actually got worse on these medications despite these interventions. So let me bring that to what is this little girl's problem? What possibly could an 11-year-old have as a problem, right? She's, as I said, children are normally really insulin sensitive, although we are seeing a lot more type 2 diabetics, a lot more obesity happening in children. We're seeing all of these chronic diseases happening at younger and younger and younger ages, which tell us a lot. Is it that our genes have changed so quickly? No, it's impossible. Our genes can't change over so few generations. The thing that has been changing really quickly is our environment, our food environment specifically, but other things in our environment as well. And this little girl, she had major, major anxiety, incredible anxiety. She also had some conflicting diagnoses. Again, funny how this often happens. We think you turn to a medical professional and you're going to be told everything and be able to cure your disease, but you often get slapped a diagnosis on you, and then the medications and the traditional ways of treating you, don't help, whether that's diabetes, it's chronic progressive disease, right? Or whether that's cancer. Let's give you chemo, let's give you radiation and prolong your life a little bit. But is it going to cure it? Sometimes. But there's a metabolic aspect that needs to be covered. In this case, the anxiety was really bad and it wasn't being helped by medications. And she did have this diagnosis potentially of being on the autism spectrum, although, we weren't sure whether that was so because in some ways she really didn't seem like she was on the spectrum. But what really mattered is her anxiety was so bad that by the age of 4, she was starting to say that she wanted to stop living. Um, she realized she was very different from her peers, and just a few years later, she went from wanting to stop living to actually wanting to kill herself. Um, and she started getting intrusive thoughts, which were thoughts about like violent things. And this is a very sensitive, very sweet, very kind little girl. You speak to her teachers, you speak to her friends. They're like, she's so gentle, so kind, so lovely. And yet she's being haunted. I would say tormented by these violent images which pop into her head of things, the worst things that she could imagine, like a child's worst fears, whether that is, let's say, her pet having a knife stabbed into it, or it's just the worst thing that that child could
Wow.
imagine. Those kind of thoughts would be popping into her head, and then she would just become this like distraught ball of tears, right? And you're like, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" It's like there's this thought. I don't want to tell you. You think I'm a bad person, but she doesn't want these thoughts, right? But they're in her head, horrible things. And then she also started getting OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, where her brain would tell her, okay, I'm feeling so anxious. You haven't switched off the tap. You need to do it this many times in order to switch it off. But the worst was that she was worried about germs. She'd wash her hands until they were raw. She started getting rashes up her wrists, and it was just terrible. And also separation anxiety from her mother to the point where she couldn't go to birthday parties. At the age of 11, still struggling to go to school, won't go visit, struggles, she won't sleep over anywhere, not even at her granny who helped raise her, not even at her biological father's house. She will not go, sleep anywhere. So all these kind of like you can understand from this that this level of anxiety is resulting in major functional problems for an innocent child. It, and I really want to just reiterate, this is torment. You know, she's tormented, and medications aren't helping. They even went to a psychiatric hospital to try and deal with this. It didn't help. It just made things worse. Um, so yes, there are more medications she could have tried, but she wasn't reacting tradition in an expected manner to the ones she was trying. And so her mother was just panicked and like, well, I'm sick of this, Or I think what really maybe turned her to me was that the last psychiatrist she'd seen, who wanted to put her daughter onto two medications, one of which has a lot of side effects. During the stay at the psychiatric hospital, the psychiatrist didn't tell the mother what the diagnosis was. She didn't tell the mother that she was going to put her onto medications, but that evening, the nurse in the ward gave this random medication to the mother that she didn't know what it was. So there was no informed consent there, right? There was no
Wow.
information given. There was no consent given for the medication. And the mother happened to see the doctor leaving for the evening in the car park, and she said to her, she stopped her. She said, "I'm so sorry, doctor, to disturb you, but I just wanted to let you know I'm not giving my daughter this medication tonight. But we can talk about it tomorrow, and you can explain to me your reasoning, and then we can look at it again." And the doctor said, "Your daughter should have been on that medication years ago, and if you don't put her on it now, you're not going to have a daughter." So she says this to the mother,
Wow.
who's already suffering, right? That basically your child's going to be dead if you don't put her onto the medication tonight. Like, that's insane. So you can imagine the basically this is a family, right? That's lives are being turned upside down by this torment, by this, yeah. So it's horrible. So they come to me. They say they've heard that a ketogenic diet helps for epilepsy and seizures, and is starting to be used in adults for things like bipolar and schizophrenia. And there's quite a lot of evidence for its use in schizophrenia, bipolar, and also for anxiety in those conditions. Um, can we try this? So I said, okay, let's try it. So we tried it. And within the first 2 weeks, we started seeing significant improvements. And mainly what we monitored was anxiety related feelings. So it was the anxiety, which was sometimes worse at night. So we monitored daytime anxiety, nighttime anxiety, OCD, which was with that hand washing, raw kind of rubbing of hands and continuous asking safety behaviors, like, which is basically, it's like a confession. She's like, it's like her mother's the priest, and she constantly has to confess everything in order to feel, it's like a compulsion, in order to feel like she can go on with life. So it's hectic, when they're in public, she'll come whisper in her mom's ear a, a, a safety behavior in order to be able to stop worrying about whatever it is she's worrying about. So this is, yeah. Anyway, so we monitored that daily. So the mother captured the OCD, how bad the OCD was daily, how bad the anxiety was daily, and then also this child really struggles with academic demand avoidance. So any demand, especially academic, um, there's a compulsion to avoid it. You can imagine how hard this makes it this child to teach. She's so good in every other context. She doesn't generally avoid demands, but within the academic context, she avoids demands. So she's fallen 2 years behind in her academics now, right? As well, even though every psychologist, educational psychologist, everyone says, oh, she's highly intelligent. So this is also difficult, right? She's now 2, 3 grade levels behind. Her peers, she has had to be pulled out of school, homeschool. So every single aspect of life is being affected by this, what's going on mentally in this child. So every day, a food diary was kept on using an app. An app, it could be Chronometer, but in this case, it was Fat Secret because Fat Secret has a lot of South African foods on it. Um, so every day monitoring exactly what she's eating, um, to try and get her into ketosis. So ketosis is when your body basically turns mainly fat, but it can also turn protein, but mainly fat into short little fats. And these short little fats are called ketones. And what's really important about ketones is that they can fuel the brain in a very similar way to how glucose fuels the brain. The brain can't run on long fats. It can only run on these short fats called ketones. And they go into the brain and they can actually supply the brain with 80% of its fuel. In other words, the brain only needs to get 20% of its fuel from glucose. And that glucose your own body can make, so you don't even have to get it from food. Um, so yeah, so basically you're trying to get the body into the state where it produces these short fats called ketones, and these short fats do various things in the brain that are thought to help with mental conditions. Um, and I can talk to you about those things, but basically we won't go into the mechanisms just yet unless you want to. But I must actually just pull up my data so that I have it in front of me, or as Americans say, data. Um, but even when I say it, doesn't sound like you guys. Okay, so basically, in month one, the scores went from being moderate to severe down to mild to moderate, and by the third month on keto, she went down to mild anxiety and mild OCD by the third month on keto. So yes, it was 3 months, but we already saw these kind of results within that first month. It just got slightly better by the third month. So, and these are daily scores. Now, if you just look at the daily scores, you get a lot of fluctuation because it could be a bad day or could be a good day, but you'll generally find the trend is towards better days. Um, so less reactivity to similar stresses. Um, just getting a little bit less. There'll still be a reaction to that stress, all right? But it just won't be as bad. So we might not have a full-blown meltdown with wishing to just kill yourself or terrible intrusive thoughts happening. Instead, you might, have a little tear. You're still going to be upset. So I'm saying better resilience. And and then the only thing that didn't change actually was the academic demand avoidance didn't seem to really change. So we achieved moderate ketosis, which was measured by measuring a finger prick, like blood, ketones. So it was mild ketosis. Quite a lot of the researchers in the space at the moment are saying that you should aim for higher ketones. So we achieved 0.6 millimoles per liter of the main ketone called beta hydroxybutyrate. That's what we got, 0.6. If you look at, for example, Laurie Calabrese's practice and her recent, she also spoke at the conference. her recent publication on 3 case studies, which is called a case series, where they aimed for zero point 0.8. So we got 0.6 in this case. She's aiming for over 0.8, and other people aim for over 1. But then you'll look at another speaker there, Drew Decker, and he is from Volick's lab in Ohio State University. And in their study, they found that just over zero point 0.5, which is low, again, ketosis, saw significant benefits um, in depression and anxiety in healthy students really who were suffering with depression. It was actually depression, not anxiety in this case. So the point is we don't really know what level of ketones are optimal, and we're actually carrying on with this N of 1 case and seeing if higher ketones can achieve better results. And then I'll be writing it up for publication after that. So give me another 3 months or so. But already just with low, like mild ketosis, we're achieving results that change the life of this child and this family. Intrusive thoughts are basically gone. So those thoughts that made her think of like violent, like her worst fears come to life in her head. Those thoughts were basically gone. She maybe started getting them once a month from periods of getting them daily, multiple times a day. It's huge. So that torment is basically gone or very, very infrequent. Um, the safety behaviors also reduced. So the safety behaviors are the confessional behaviors, if you will, to the mother. And importantly, the anxiety, the worry, the thoughts of wanting to die completely stopped. And now it's been more than 3 months. Now it's been almost, I think, 6 months on the diet, or maybe less, 5 months. There's not been one thought in that period of time. So almost half a year of that. So it's if you think about what this means to a little girl and to her mother and to her family, it's and there's so many children who are struggling like this, and so many more adults as well. And the evidence is rising a lot in adults, but there's less in children apart from epilepsy. Um, and that's why this N of 1 is important. That's why a case study in this case is important. Yes, we would rather have 100, and a randomized control trial. But the truth is, research always starts with case studies. Case studies are a way to develop hypotheses. So from this case study, the hypothesis is that nutritional ketosis induces clinically significant changes in anxiety in an 11-year-old child. Could it improve other children's anxiety too? And that's when the next kind of trial starts happening, the next kind of study. And then we move on and we move up. And eventually we have lots of randomized control trials. And then we can compare them and do a systematic review and meta-analysis and achieve the highest level of evidence. But you always start with case studies, then case series, and that's how it goes. And that's why this kind of work is important and has to be published. Maybe on a topic that has already got a huge amount of data, then case studies are kind of irrelevant because we already know this stuff. But in this space, we don't know this stuff, especially in children, and that's why this is important. And also, it's important because, like diabetes, a chronic progressive condition, in so many children and adults do not experience resolution of their symptoms on medication. And for those people, to have an alternative and to offer hope that actually works it's huge. It's huge. It can change their lives, whether it's used as an adjunct with treatment or standalone in people who don't respond to treatment or who want to try something different.
Wow, it's absolutely wonderful. It's hard not to get emotional, frankly, talking about some of this stuff. And the thing I loved about your presentation, I noticed it with Lori, who you mentioned as well, and also Guido Frank, who did the
Mm,
presentation about anorexia nervosa, which I thought was incredible,
mm.
is you
Yes.
guys present the case studies and tell the stories, and these are the
Mm,
people, and this is what happened, and this was the data. But it's more than that because you also go into what you mentioned, which is the mechanisms. And we don't necessarily need to talk about the mechanisms today, but you
mm,
explain why this would be the case. It's not just that we randomly did this and we were looking to see if it would work. And we have no idea whether it would or not. It's like we think it's going to work because of this. And then you walk through all the mechanisms and it's like, oh, okay, so that all makes sense. It's part of the reason why, like, for as many times as I've heard these incredible stories, and I'm like, I can't believe how powerful a therapeutic diet like this is. At the same
Mm,
time, I'm also not surprised. It doesn't really surprise me that much. It's
mm,
amazing to hear, but you already know how these things are going to turn out because we've been able to explain all the science and mechanism behind it, and we're
mm.
calling our shots as we go. Like, it's so
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, Casey, you are so right because I mean, I can briefly summarize it, and it's quite interesting when you come to grips with this. But basically, all mental health conditions, whether it's anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, bipolar, or even neurological, neurodevelopmental conditions like autistic spectrum disorder or Alzheimer's or whatever, they all have six underlying mechanisms in common, and they're metabolic mechanisms. One is inflammation and neuroinflammation. Inflammation is your body's first line defense, immune defense. And when that goes on, when you get a nail in your foot, it's appropriate to become inflamed, which is redness, and it calls all the immune system to arms and sorts out this nail in your foot and tries to fight any germs that came in. But inflammation should be acute. It shouldn't be long term. When it's long term, it causes damage. So all mental health conditions have inflammation in the brain. All of them have a level of insulin resistance or glucose, cerebral glucose hypometabolism. It sounds big, but all it means is that the brain cells can't use glucose or sugar, which is the main brain fuel in most people. It can't use it properly. So the brain has a metabolic aberration. That means that it can't process glucose properly, which means it basically can starve quite easily, right? The third thing is mitochondria. Mitochondria are the powerhouse or the little organelle that actually was originally its own organism that went to live inside human cells. Interestingly, it's its own little thing. But yeah, mitochondria, which make energy, they are dysfunctional in all mental health and neurological conditions that I'm aware of. And interestingly, they affect all the other pathways that are involved as well. So some people like Christopher Palmer in his recent book Brain Energy, he basically blames mitochondria for everything, which is possible because they do seem to affect everything. But then everything seems to affect them and everything else. So um, and then the other aberration or problem is with neurotransmission. So the neurotransmitters, which we thought were at the root of all mental conditions, if we just corrected serotonin, if we just correct dopamine, if we just correct noradrenaline or norepinephrine, we'll be fine. But it doesn't work like that because we can correct those. You take a medication, and within a matter of days or weeks, or well, actually a matter of days, the neurotransmitters have corrected, but it takes 6 weeks before you start seeing results in the people who you see results in. And that's not a
Mm.
neurotransmitter reason for that, because the neurotransmitters are improved within days of taking the medication, but the symptoms are not. Now, underlying all of these, there are neurotransmitter problems, but the neurotransmitter problems seem to be caused by things like inflammation, for example, or mitochondrial dysfunction, because neurotransmitters have basically they are produced often. The production starts in the mitochondria in many cases, and their signaling ends in the mitochondria in many cases. For example, inflammation can increase um, it can increase glutamate and reduce GABA, which is your calming neurotransmitter, thereby increasing anxiety. So these conditions affect the neurotransmitters or these aberrations. And then microbiome, there's a dysregulation in the gut, which can affect the brain because the gut and the brain are connected. And then oxidative stress, which is basically free radical damage, which is happening in all these conditions. So inflammation, glucose hypometabolism or starving brain cells, mitochondrial dysfunction, neurotransmitter dysfunction caused by metabolic reasons, microbiome dysfunction, and oxidative stress. And all of those things are wrong, potentially all caused by the mitochondria. And what corrects every single one of them? What's been shown in literature for a long time to correct every single one of them? A ketogenic diet. A ketogenic diet lowers inflammation. It reduces pro-inflammatory cytokines. A ketogenic diet provides ketones to feed the brain when the brain can't use glucose. A ketogenic diet increases mitochondrial functioning, um, and increases the energy the mitochondria produces, thereby also feeding the brain. A ketogenic diet balances neurotransmitters, giving you more calming GABA and less excitatory glutamate and more serotonin and noradrenaline, which are associated with those antidepressants that people normally take, right? Microbiome. Your microbiome is also altered in a way that could benefit the brain and reduce inflammation and reduce oxidative stress. And then oxidative stress, which is the free radical damage, is reduced again by a ketogenic diet, potentially because the mitochondria are functioning better and they aren't producing as many free radicals. So a ketogenic diet affects all of the metabolic underpinnings of mental health conditions. And so we already know that. We know that from mechanistic studies in cells, and we know that from animal studies. And now we are applying it in humans and starting to see the benefits associated with these things. So,
It's
yeah, so you're absolutely right.
so amazing. The thing that I don't know, it makes me so mad. It ticks me off that this is not new information. Like when you're talking about the
Yeah.
state of ketosis and what happens and how the body creates all the glucose it needs, I I I just so wish I would have come across my favorite study ever, which was done 50, 60 years ago by George Cahill, where he takes people, fasts them for 40 days, shows exactly what happens, how the body uses all its energy, how it shifts over to a state of ketosis, how much fuel the brain uses from ketones,
Mhm.
how all the cells adapt to that, how your gluconeogenesis, creating the sugar you need, actually drops after a few days because you're using ketones and not glucose. Like I've got this
Mhm.
giant nutrition textbook behind me, and not one mention of that study that's a major metabolic pathway of the body that explains so many things. I'm guessing you never came
Yeah,
across that with all of the years of formal education into
I
dietetics that you
know.
got. You probably never got exposed to that.
No, and I studied biochemistry for 3 years in my undergraduate degree as well. So you would think you're studying all these metabolic pathways, but did I study ketosis? Did I study the ketogenic pathway? Okay, somewhat from protein, but that was more like, oh, if you're starving and you start to break down your muscle, they can turn into ketones, and then that's not good because you're starving in a concentration camp and now you're breaking down your muscle. But no one said, well, actually, you break down your fat and turn that into ketones, and you can do that without starving. So yeah, no, absolutely not. And that's why at Nutrition Network we developed the first textbook in this space called Ketogenic with that big egg in the front. But if you Google it, Ketogenic, the science of therapeutic carbohydrate restriction in human health, um, that textbook we've gathered up most of the big names in the space, most of the experts, and we've tried to cover as much as we can in the limited word count or page count that we had so that clinicians, coaches, lay people even can turn to whatever chapter they're interested in, whether that's Parkinson's or cancer or, Alzheimer's or, I don't know, behavioral modification in order to sustain this kind of dietary change, whatever it is you're interested in related to ketogenic diet, we put it down there and it's heavily referenced. So for any statement, you can just turn to the back of that chapter, find the reference, go and look it up yourself on Google, and um and that's why, because we need to start changing the training, the training of our clinicians and what we think, we need to be updated. We just need to update our thinking. Yeah,
Yeah.
based on the science.
It's so incredible the work you guys do at Nutrition Network, and that book is absolutely incredible. I mean, it is huge. To say that it's limited in the things you could talk about there, you had a page count like that thing is thick, really, really big. So I'm sure it must have felt like a flyby to put it together, but it is quite the reference. It's absolutely amazing. You referred to this earlier, but what does this kind of lead to now? Like, what are the next steps from this?
From the textbook or from the study or
From the study, I should have clarified from the study itself.
okay. Well, definitely with regards to this, like the bug has bitten for me to see this kind of difference in someone's life. You can't unsee it. And in a child, it always kind of, I don't know, tweaks our heartstrings when we see it in a little child, or in a defenseless animal, whatever it is. You kind of like, oh my gosh, like look at the suffering. and look at how it can be alleviated. Although I wouldn't say it was alleviated, so I do want to say that caveat. This she's not cured, at least at this level of ketones, which is why I want to go deeper into ketosis. But she's significantly better. Um, and so where to next? I'm going to go into deeper ketosis with her, see if it makes it better. And then we're going to publish. And then I'm going to start talking about this more. I was even thinking like I'm inspired by people like you who do podcasts and YouTube channels. And I was thinking, I need to start talking about this because I don't think there's enough being spoken about the space of mental health, and all the things, the metabolic basis of it. Yes, there's metabolic mind, but I think everybody who can, like you, dive into this and advocate and raise awareness, I think it's so important because most people that I've spoken to have no idea. Have no idea it can help. And with this much suffering, we need to spread the word so that people can be helped, and they can stop suffering like this. So I definitely want to continue my work with Nutrition Network, continue training, continue writing textbooks, getting the clinicians on board and knowledgeable about the space, but also to do a bit more advocacy. Now that I'm inspired, you say before we went live, I think you said that you're an introvert. And I said, I'm also an introvert, and this kind of thing can be tough for us. But if we believe in it strongly enough, I think we have a moral duty to do it. So, everyone on your channel, you can look out eventually. Maybe in the next month or two, I might start talking about this a bit more publicly.
Good. Well, I certainly hope so. You are very well spoken and definitely have a great angle on this and have a really strong message to share. So I really appreciate that. I know that with Nutrition Network, I got your newsletter either yesterday or today, and I know you've got some more courses coming out, including one all about exercise. So I'm very much looking
Yes.
forward to that. I saw Dr. Kukazella,
Hmm.
Dr. Tim Noakes on there as well. Some other people I thought I knew like that. You must be excited about
Yeah.
that as well.
So what's so exciting about this one is we've had a talk on, or we've had a course already on athletes, right, using keto, which is really important and really interesting. But for the regular Joe soap, for the average person, there's very, very little guidance on how to use keto and how to adapt your exercise strategy in that for keto, or even to start exercising with keto. I've heard clinicians say when they put someone on keto diet, because now they're educated on how beneficial it can be, they say, when you go on this diet, you must stop exercising.
Wow.
Like, that's wrong. That's completely wrong. And so this module or this training is so important because it's teaching clinicians, coaches, and even lay people on how to figure out what exercise they can do or should be doing while they're adapting to this way of eating. And it goes beyond that. It even goes into functional movements and how to figure out what the person in front of you can or should not be doing and what the next step is. Because most doctors, dietitians, we don't know. We see someone in front of them, we say, okay, well, you should be moving, go exercise, or go for a walk. Like, we don't know. We're not like you, Casey, who's you know how to train people. Um, Most clinicians don't. They just know that people should be moving, they should be exercising, but we don't know more than that. And that's what this course teaches clinicians, teaches you how to incorporate physical activity into your patient's program. And that is so important because while we emphasize diet, and I'm a dietitian, so I see through my diet glasses all the time, and I often ignore other things like exercise, seeing enough sunlight, reducing your stress, all those really important things, sleep. But you can't. As I said with my gut, right? I said I'm cured most of the time, or I'm in remission most of the time, but I get stressed. What happens? If I'm stressed for long enough, and that's not diet that's caused that, but if I'm stressed, my gut is terrible. And so diet can't cure that. So we have to look at ourselves holistically, and we have to improve not just, we can start with one thing because otherwise it's overwhelming. Start with getting your eating right. And when I say diet, I really mean eating, the way you eat. I don't mean a fad diet. So get the way you eat right, and then work on all the other really important aspects. Exercise, or you can call it physical activity or movement, stress, sleep, light, um, connection. whether that's community, family, friends, whatever it is. And then you can call it spirituality, or you can, depending on what you are, what you believe, but it could just be nature, it could be connecting with nature. For me, it's just going for a walk on the beach or going for a hike in the mountain or just listening quietly to the birds. That is my kind of connection. It's a connection to just, I think, to nature, but it could be to God, it could be whatever it is for you. Um, all of these aspects are so important. So I just want to remind people about that while we're talking about diet. There's more than diet to optimal health.
I love that. That's going to be a very valuable resource. And speaking of adorable little girls, I am aware that you have one in your house that probably needs to go to bed very soon. We are on very different time zones and time schedules today, so I want to make sure that you're able to get your daughter to bed. This was such an
Thank
amazing
you.
chat. I just so much respect your work. The way you presented it at the conference was incredible. The way you just presented it to us here was also incredible. And you're right, we got to get this message out to more people because the suffering, like you mentioned, just has to stop. And if people only realize that they could start with this and try it and see if it works, that would be enough. You know what I mean? So I really appreciate
Exactly.
you and your work, Tamzyn. Where would you like people to go to find you and connect with you and your work?
Oh, thank you, Casey. So please go to Nutrition Network. You can Google us, but you can go also to www.nutrition-network.org. And you can contact me there as well. My first name is Tamzyn. It's a very strange one, I realize. It's Tamz or ZYN and then it's nutrition-network.org. So you can contact me there. You can also find me on Facebook. You can find me on X. You can find me on Instagram, and you can also find Nutrition Network on all of those platforms as well. You'll notice that again, I haven't been that active, but I'm getting more active on these social media platforms. So you can contact me either privately in that way or through Nutrition Network. And absolutely, if you want to be learning more on the space, Nutrition Network is the gold standard training platform. That's where you can go, and you can do it from the privacy of your own home. And you can learn about any of the topics with regards to keto diets that interest you, really. So, yeah.
Yeah, lovely. We will link up to all of that in the show notes, and I will look very much forward to seeing you out there more. You, like I said, are a very powerful voice in the space and have a lot of information to share. So, Tamzyn, thank you so very much for everything you've been able to share with us today, and thank you for taking time to be on our show. We really appreciate you.
Thank you, Casey, and I really appreciate the work you do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And this has been another episode of Balanced Body Radio.